Hi, my name is Sarah Holger. I'm with Project Get Outdoors, and I'm excited to share about this oral history project that we've been working on this past year. I first want to say thank you to the Minnesota Historical Society and the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment for funding this project. And actually, that means thank you to all of you who are Minnesota residents and taxpayers in Minnesota, because that's how that legacy amendment is funded. I also want to thank several other folks. You maybe heard that term or that saying, "We stand on the shoulders of giants." And I wouldn't be able to do the research that I have been able to do, have been fortunate to do, if it wasn't for all these folks listed on this list here that have been doing this work way before me. So first and foremost, Dr. Carol Jefferson, who is down in Winona, Minnesota, and I'll talk more about Dr. Jefferson throughout this presentation because she's my mentor. Also, doctors William Green and Christopher Lehman, who are professors at different colleges in Minnesota, and I'll refer to them a few times throughout this presentation as well. And I've never met them in person. We've emailed on some different projects, but I would love to sit down and interview both of those gentlemen one of these days. Some of our local historians, Laura Deering and Jeff Broberg, genealogist Elise Hill, who has actually been very instrumental in some Underground Railroad research and getting some sites documented with the National Park Service here in Minnesota. Genealogist Micah Anders, who is out of the Twin Cities and does a lot of great research on early Black settlers in Minnesota. And then also historian Karen Sieber, who is more recent to the scene here in Minnesota as far as the Underground Railroad research, but she's been involved in a project that she started in the last year here. And then the county historical societies in Southeast Minnesota have been amazing allies. And a lot of those folks are volunteers or they're not full-time workers. And so I just want to make sure to give a big shout out to those county historical societies. And also in a few different states, we've been reaching out and having conversations and getting information from archives from other states as well, because these abolitionists and anti-slavery folks were all migrants. They all came here from somewhere else in the 1850s. And so a lot of this research is taking place at looking at their stories before they came here when they were living in other states. And really, I want to just express my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the people that sat down with me and let me interview them, because I know it can be uncomfortable and kind of scary to be interviewed. And a lot of these folks who are the descendants of abolitionists didn't know a whole lot about their ancestors. And so they were a little nervous to talk to me because they didn't really think that they would have much to share. But I can say that every single person I talked to taught me something and gave me another perspective and gave me some clues that actually helped really tell the story of the abolitionists in Southeast Minnesota. So I just want to thank all those families, which we'll talk about in this presentation. And then I also sat down with some historians, researchers, and an author and interviewed some other folks like that. So just thank you to all of those folks. So for this project, we're focusing specifically on Southeast Minnesota, and I define that as these 6 counties. That might not be the legal definition, but that's how I defined it. So I was specifically looking at the Mississippi River corridor and then 2 counties that are a little bit inland from that. So Fillmore County, Goodhue County, Houston County, Olmsted County, Wabasha County, and Winona County. So I work for Project Get Outdoors, and Project Get Outdoors is a nonprofit organization based in Wabasha, Minnesota, and we've been around for 20 years. We began in the year 2005, and our organization focuses on connecting children to nature and to the outdoors. And so you might be thinking, well, what does abolitionists and the Underground Railroad have to do with getting children and kids outdoors? But actually, if you think about it for a little bit, it's not too crazy to think. Not everybody, not everybody in Minnesota wants to hike, bike, fish, or camp. We need to find other ways to connect people to the land, and storytelling is a powerful way to do that. And so, we're envisioning that down the road here, we could maybe work with local counties to create kind of like they've done in Iowa. They've created a freedom trail where they highlight the stories of abolitionists, and they actually had a huge presence of the Underground Railroad in Iowa, where it's very well documented. But telling the stories of these anti-slavery folks and people that have been fighting for freedom for hundreds of years. Um, so there's potential to do like a self-guided trail, have interpretive signage at cemeteries, things like that. So that's something that we're really excited about because we could work with schools then and help guide and train teachers to be able to get kids outdoors through this kind of historic storytelling. There's also opportunities to work with the National Park Service Network to Freedom, which is a program that lists sites where abolitionists lived, worked, where there were underground railroad stations or underground railroad activity. And so you can see a lot of the dots on the map are out east. We do have one little dot there in Minnesota now. Yay! And actually, there's two. There's going to be a second dot added. But Elise Hill, the genealogist I mentioned at the beginning, she is the key reason those sites are being added to the Minnesota map. She's been doing a ton of research and helping the Pilgrim Baptist Church in St. Paul, and then a Minneapolis Pioneer and Soldiers Memorial Cemetery also recently got listed. And so hopefully in a few years we can have a couple dots down in southeast Minnesota as well. So a little bit more about my background. So I was raised by Jackie Ray and Steve Otterson. So Jackie Ray is my mom on the left there. That's my mom and myself and my sister Mila, and then my dad Steve Otterson. And we grew up on the West Metro, kind of far west end of Lake Minnetonka in a town called Mound, Westonka. Actually, kind of hopped around because my parents got divorced and my mom moved a lot. She like seemed to move every year or so, and but we always stayed on that west end of the lake. So that was where the Tonka toys used to be made in Mound. And so I also like to say that the lake was also one of my parents because I spent a lot of time down at the beach and near the water, and we had a swamp in our backyard. And so the red-winged blackbirds, the weeping willow trees, that was all part of my family. I spent a lot of time in nature as a kid. But growing up, my understanding of my heritage or my ethnicity was that my mom's side had Irish and Scottish, and that there was some Cherokee Indian also in the family. We didn't know anything more than that. And then on my dad's side, it was pretty much Scandinavian. So the third picture over is my grandpa Otterson and all the grandkids piled on his lap. He was just this amazing, funny, hilarious human being, a joker, told a lot of jokes. He oofta and a lot of Scandinavian phrases. And so that was a real rich part of my growing up, just knowing we were part Scandinavian, being very proud of that. On the far right, that's my grandpa Jack. So that's my mom's dad. And I didn't know much about him actually. Him and my grandma, they lived in Oregon and they didn't move to Minnesota until I was in like eighth grade, seventh or eighth grade. And then my grandma passed away when I was in high school. So I only had a few years with her. And my grandpa was kind of a vagabond. He was kind of moving around a lot. So I didn't really get to know him super duper well. I did spend a little bit of time with him, like when I was in my early 30s. But I never really sat down and appreciated that time to like interview him. And so now I'm trying to do the genealogy and figure out more about my family. This is relevant to what I'm talking about today because I did a DNA test. My kids got me a DNA test. I think it was during COVID. I think it was my oldest daughter was really the one behind that because I think she was really curious about the Cherokee heritage and wanted to know more about that. And so I did the DNA test right away when I got my results back. Some really interesting things. First of all, I'm related to Jesse James. Not bragging about that necessarily. That's interesting. My grandma, the one that said we were Cherokee, she also used to always say that we were related to the Youngers who rode with the Jameses. So not too far off here. We're actually related to Jesse James. And then even more interesting on the right-hand side, this is through 23andMe. It said, you have more Neanderthal DNA than 85% of other customers. So when I'm having a rough day, I try to maybe blame it on that. But my ancestry composition was very interesting. Some people, like my husband, he did his, and it was like 99% Norwegian, and the other little 0.1% was Swedish. And he was upset about that he wasn't 100% Norwegian. I was like, what? But there are people who have 100% Norwegian or 100%, British, or it's just Northern European. I got a little bit of a mix of stuff. I mean, it was mostly Northwestern European, but if you go down to the 1.1, it also showed Sub-Saharan African, so Congolese and Southern East African, specifically Angolan and Congolese. Then there was trace ancestry and unassigned. And one thing that's really neat with the 23andMe, at least, is every year they like rerun it. And as the technology gets better and better, it gets more detailed. So I get new reports at least once a year. And so they were able to kind of dig into that trace ancestry and determine it was North African. So I have two different like regions of Africa that are showing up visibly in my DNA today. Now this has been watered down in my daughter's. My oldest daughter took a DNA test and it doesn't show any African. And she was very sad about that because so that was something that she was like really excited to learn more about, which she still can, but to like claim that it's still in her and it is in her ancestry. But to be able to show that in a DNA test, I think she was sad that she doesn't have that. The unassigned, it's so small that they don't really know what it is, and that could be the Cherokee story that my grandma was talking about. We don't know. The most recent update, though, to my DNA showed that the African ancestry they could pinpoint it a little bit more, and it said I was part of the African diaspora, specifically in the Georgia coastal plain African Americans and the North Carolina northern coastal plain African Americans. So I've been on a real personal journey of discovery the last few years, trying to learn more about this. And what I've discovered from a lot of the readings I've done is if I have that much African heritage still or DNA that's showing up in my genetics, that's not that far back in my family tree. That's like 200 years ago. That's like not not super much further before the Civil War. So this is most likely a story of slavery in my own family, which I have been doing ancestry on and finding that there were a lot of enslavers in my ancestry, which is a really hard pill to swallow. It's a really difficult thing to come to terms with. I don't think you can ever really accept that, but it's just, I can't change my ancestors. All I can do is move forward in a better way. So a couple other interesting things that came out of that DNA test was, and I already kind of knew this, but the dad that raised me isn't my biological dad. And so the DNA just confirmed that. And so my biological dad is actually somebody who was a friend of the family's from out in Oregon. And so what's interesting with that DNA line is his grandfather, great grandfather was this man on the far right. So this guy is a notorious outlaw. I'm not laughing, but inside I kind of am. It's like, okay, this my family makes a lot of sense. But this is William Adams Hickman. And so if you Google him, he was the bodyguard to Brigham Young. And he has a really interesting story. Did some icky things, murdered a lot of people, but has a really interesting story. So he never was an enslaver, but I did find that his father, when his father was younger, had enslaved persons working for him. So that family line, I'm sure if I go back, I'm going to find a lot more folks that were enslavers, which is icky. On the left-hand side, that's in that family photo, right in the middle, in the back row, that's my grandma Ruby when she was a kiddo. And she was the one that always talked about being part Cherokee. And she believed that till the day she died. So I'm not sure what the story was and how it got handed down in her family. But as far as we know, we're not seeing Cherokee in the DNA. And my mom did her DNA too, and it showed African, but it did not show Cherokee. In the middle is the baby there is my grandpa Jack when he was a baby, and that's his dad. The last name is Ray, W-R-A-Y. They're actually from Virginia, and we didn't know much about him because he took off when my grandpa was little. But I got somebody reached out to me on Ancestry just within the last month or two here and said your DNA matches my or matches my mother's DNA. So you guys are related. And there's this big research DNA project going on in Virginia. It's like Cairns Cove, Virginia, something like that, where they're trying to trace their indigenous and African ancestry. So we might have pinpointed it. It might have actually been all along through my mom's dad's side. Not sure. That's a mystery that's slowly unraveling. So we're all trying to link our DNA so we can kind of figure out exactly in the genome like where we're matching. So it's been a really wild ride. I also found out that I have a sister that I didn't know about. So right smack dab in the middle of this picture, she's got her glasses on and her little hang low, whatever that symbol is, hands up there. Um, so actually, the dad that raised me, who's not my biological dad, before he shipped off to the Marine Corps in the early 1970s, he didn't realize that he had a little too much fun and got somebody pregnant. So we found out that we had a sister out there. So she'd be my adoptive sister. But the girl to the right of her is my half sister. We have the same mom, and there's a lot of similarities in there because those two share the same dad. So it's like, oh my gosh. So we had a welcome to the family party this last summer, and all of the cousins got together and the aunts and uncles, and it was just a really, really awesome thing to like say, we have new family members, yay! So my background is as an interpretive naturalist or an environmental educator. I'm not a historian. I don't have the research backgrounds, the skills to go in and to know what to look for in archives and how you maneuver those systems that can be really tricky to find information. So I worked for Minnesota State Parks for about 25 years and at several other like Bell Museum of Natural History, Eagle Bluff Environmental Learning Center. I was all over the place with environmental education and working for the state parks. I was really able to enhance my interpretive skills. And so if you go to a national park or a state park and you have a park ranger giving a talk, leading a hike, doing some sort of a historical presentation, those are interpretive naturalists, and they're trained to interpret that resource to you in a way that is engaging, thought-provoking, educational, but also inspiring. That's going to motivate you to go back home and like get involved in a positive way related to that subject or that theme or that topic that they were presenting on. And so a lot of times we're able to bring in our talents like music, like art, like theater, to be able to convey these sometimes very sensitive topics. So that's kind of my background. And I got involved with oral history while I was at Whitewater State Park. I worked there for 17 years down here in Winona County. And we started an oral history project in 2017 so that we could collect stories from campers, park visitors, local neighbors, and then be able to highlight those stories in 2019 with our centennial anniversary. And we did that. We made two little documentary films and two podcasts. But there were so many stories coming in, and people would say, you have to go talk to Uncle Bob. He has some great rattlesnake stories. Or you need to talk to so and so who can tell you about the German prisoners of war who were at Whitewater. And so my list just kept growing and growing of people that I wanted to interview. So even after 2019, when the centennial anniversary wrapped up, I continued doing these oral history projects. And it started feeding into when there was COVID, and I'm still interviewing people during the COVID time. We were doing telephone interviews, and then George Floyd was murdered. And then there was the social unrest. And then I took a hard look at myself, just like I think most people in Minnesota and around the world, and really started thinking, what is my privilege? What is the lens that I've been using when I'm interpreting these resources to visitors? Um, how welcoming am I as far as bringing in different perspectives? And so I really started to think about how I could change or do better in the work that I was doing. And so part of that was, what are the stories I've been gathering through the oral history project? If you look at the visitors to Minnesota State Parks, by and far, they're white, older adults who are upper middle class to upper class. So it's a specific like segment of the population. Those stories were pretty similar. How can I reach above and beyond that to gather different stories? And we live in an amazing region in Southeast Minnesota with so much history that spans thousands of years when we're thinking about humans. Could I reach out to the colleges in the area, some of the different professors, just getting more creative in how I was inviting people to share their stories. And so I started to think about like diverse stories I had heard in the area. And I remembered back to, I was doing a little research on the Whitewater area for a program called Legends and Lore of the Whitewater area. And I came across a story in a history book about St. Charles, Minnesota. So it's the town that's just south of Whitewater State Park. And there was a story about Division Street, and a lot of towns have a division street that runs through town. But this story talked about how during the Civil War, people who were like pro-South sympathizers had to stay on the south side of that division street. And then people who were like for the North, for the Union were on the north side. And I was like, what? Baloney. Like we were in free territory. Like wasn't everybody here fighting for the Union? Like we were all against slavery, right? So that one I kind of filed in the back of my noggin because I thought that's an interesting perspective. And then I had heard a story in Plainview about a house with tunnels under it down in this valley that was supposedly part of the Underground Railroad. And then as I was researching for this program, I was talking to a coworker about the Underground Railroad, and he said, "Oh yeah, Rushford has an Underground Railroad stop. Like, yeah, everybody in town knows about it." And I was like, he was so nonchalant about it, like, yeah, no, it's everybody knows about it. And I was like, that's kind of a big deal. So once again, filed that in the back of my head. So then when this time happens and I'm trying to look for diverse stories, I remembered this whole idea of the Underground Railroad. I Googled Underground Railroad in Southeast Minnesota. Three names popped up of people who had been interviewed in newspaper articles. Carol Jefferson was one of them. And so Carol Jefferson, Laura Deering, Jeff Broberg, those three, they had been doing a little bit of research. Carol had been doing for, well, now it's almost 2 decades, not necessarily on the Underground Railroad, but abolitionists and people that were involved in the Underground Railroad out east before they relocated to Minnesota. So I actually was able to sit down with all three of those folks and interview them. And those interviews are all online on the Minnesota Digital Library. If you go into that and you type in Whitewater State Park Oral History Project, those interviews come up. And so that's when I really got introduced to this concept of the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. And Carol Jefferson was incredible. And she is. She's probably the smartest human being I've ever met. And she has just been so patient with me and so just kind in sharing her knowledge and wisdom and just really teaching me like what to look for because it's a really difficult topic to research. We'll talk more about why. So Carol and I have had many adventures, and I look forward to continuing to learn from her. So I wanted to show this slide because I think this is a great kind of graphic that illustrates what I believe has been going on with these stories over the years. If you look to the left, we have a boy saying the word peas. He's whispering it into this girl's ear. She whispers to the next person bees. Then the next kid says knees, cheese, fleas, right? So that's the game telephone. And we think about like when we tell a story, each time it gets told to a new person, it changes a little bit, right? And so with this whole like legend myth of the Underground Railroad being in Southeast Minnesota, first of all, we're never gonna know probably if it was here or not. There's just no primary source evidence unless we find some diary that's been hiding away in somebody's closet for the last 200 years that specifically names names and talks about a person's personal experience, operating the Underground Railroad in southeast Minnesota. We just don't have the evidence, but there's tons of clues that suggest, yeah, it really could have happened. So on the left-hand side, we have a house that's in Rushford. That this is the house that for years people have been saying that was an Underground Railroad stop. And there's a ton of information. Well, there's not. There's stories online about that house, and you can go to the Rushford Historical Society website and read more about that. Down below, there's a picture of a church. That's the Episcopal Church, Methodist Episcopal. I think it's just Episcopal Church in Rushford. Now, that's a black and white photo. It's hard to see the people, but there is a black man in the front on the roof of that church there that was brought up as a teenager immediately following the Civil War. He was formerly enslaved, if I remember correctly. And there was a husband and wife couple from Rushford that Laura Deering has done a ton of research on. And they were kind of like missionaries down in Florida after the Civil War. They started a church down there. They led Sunday school. They taught people to read during a time when it was illegal to be doing some of that stuff. And they brought back this young man with them, and he had the stonemasonry skills. And so he was hired to help build the Episcopal Church, but some other stone structures in the area. And so his initials or his name is actually in the concrete in the basement of that church. And so when you think about, that story, that could be an origin of an Underground Railroad story. Just knowing that there was a formerly enslaved person that lived in Rushford, but it was after the war, but over the generations, maybe that detail got lost. So who knows? Who knows? On the right-hand side, the upper right corner, that is a little snippet of a letter that's on file at the Houston County Historical Society. It was written in the 1960s by Margaret Radke. She was the granddaughter of Isaac Thompson. Isaac Thompson came to Houston County to Looneyville pre-Civil War, so in the 1850s, and he was actually married to this document in the middle here is talking about the Sperrys, Anna Case Sperry and her husband Iris Sperry of New York. So Isaac Thompson, he came to Houston County with his wife, Angeline Sperry Thompson. And Angeline Sperry was the daughter of these two that ran an Underground Railroad station in New York. So that's interesting. Isaac Thompson ended up eventually purchasing the farm from George McSpadden. George McSpadden had come to Houston County early in, mid 1850s, and he fought in the Civil War. And when he came back from the Civil War, he brought with him a young, formerly enslaved boy named Cal Simmons. So that's the grave of Cal Simmons out in South Dakota. Cal Simmons spent the rest of his life with McSpadden. Where McSpadden moved, Cal Simmons moved, not necessarily living in the same house with him, but living in the same communities with him. So they are buried they're just a few graves apart from each other out in South Dakota. And Cal Simmons married and had kids, eventually got divorced, but he stayed with McSpadden his whole life. So that story there could have been a corruption of, okay, Isaac Thompson's first wife did grow up in an Underground Railroad station in New York, and McSpadden brought back a formerly enslaved young black boy to Houston County. And so these stories can warp into, yeah, that was an Underground Railroad stop. That makes sense. That makes sense. So we're going to focus on abolitionists, and a lot of these folks were involved in the Underground Railroad out east. But when you think of that word abolitionist, what do you think of? What comes to mind? And I think a lot of people, if they know much about that era, they might, if to put it in like today's terms, they might think of that word woke. And today that word's really been like turned into a bad word. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Like woke to me means you're waking up from being ignorant. You want to be a better human being. You're going to try to do better. You're awake. And so I think if we can, relate that conversation from today to the abolitionist era, the abolitionists were the woke people of their time. They were fringe. They weren't the mainstream. They were persecuted, condemned, mobbed, beaten, murdered, threatened. So a lot of what they did was in secrecy, and they operated in their own close circles within their churches and other different groups where they gathered. Obviously there's stories of famous abolitionists who spoke out, and then, as things started getting worse and worse and worse, some of them got more militant. But by and far, most of those abolitionists were operating in secrecy. So when we're talking about abolitionism for this specific project, we're specifically looking at an organization that worked to end the practice of slavery in the United States. We're looking at the period of 1830 to 1870. And this really did start as a religious movement. You'll see a lot of these folks are pretty religious, even though there were free thinkers within the group as well. It kind of begins as a religious movement, and then it becomes just a political issue, and it literally rips the country apart, right? It leads to the Civil War. And so abolitionists are different than just plain old anti-slavery folks. Abolitionists, they want the immediate and full emancipation of all enslaved people, not just in America, but all around the world, because it's a sin, and we need to cleanse ourselves of this sin. Whereas you can have anti-slavery folks who say, well, I don't want slavery spreading into the free territory. Like, I don't want to see it expand, but I really don't care about it in the South. If it's in the South, that's fine. That's not impacting me, but I don't want to see it expanding. And so you have these different degrees of like tolerance for slavery. The abolitionists had zero tolerance for it. And so when we look at different groups out there, like the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, there's different within those parties. There's different degrees of tolerance for slavery. So I just came across this series. It was from the American Experience. It was on PBS, and I ordered it through my library here, and they were able to get it because the Austin County Library has it. Austin Public Library in Mower County. And so I was able to get it for free through the library and watch it. It's 3 episodes. They're each an hour long, and it highlights some of these major abolitionists, and it just really gives you a great kind of foundational understanding of the abolition movement. So I do recommend that series. It's great. I also want to just touch on some acts and movements that were happening, kind of building up this abolitionist movement, because you really need to understand some of the bigger things that were happening outside of Minnesota too. So I've listed on the right-hand side some different acts and movements that we're going to mention and legal cases, and then we're going to try to match the definitions on the left-hand side. So the first one on the upper left, a series of religious revivals in American Christianity, American Christian history taking place between the early 18th century and the late 20th century. This would be the Great Awakening. And so, I mean, I guess the big takeaway from the Great Awakening is this literally divided churches in half. We have this movement where people are discussing how we can have a personal relationship with God. We don't need to go through a pastor, a priest, a reverend. We can directly communicate to God, and that we need to be held responsible for our actions. Like we need to be morally active and in our daily lives working to make the world better for everybody. And so this begins to really rip the church apart, and you see these churches that divide over slavery. The next one, a pair of federal laws that allowed for the capture and return of runaway enslaved people within the territory of the United States. So there were 2 sets of these, one in 1793, one in 1850. These are the Fugitive Slave Acts or the Fugitive Slave Laws. And so I'm just going to read an excerpt here. So in 1793, the first Fugitive Slave Act authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and impose penalties on anyone who aided in their flight. Widespread resistance to the 1793 law led to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which added more provisions regarding runaways and levied even harsher punishments for interfering in their capture. Well, actually, that second one, when it passed in 1850, it actually said like if you're a bystander and you know that there's freedom seekers in your community and you don't do something to catch them or to report them, you can be held liable. And like that means imprisoned and like your property can be taken away from you. And so when that act passed, that was so controversial that people became abolitionists because they were so infuriated. Okay, the next one, controversial acts of legislation that allowed for the westward expansion of slavery in America. So there were two of these. This is 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Let's see, it admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state and prohibited slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase lands. But then in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise and it stoked national tensions over slavery and contributed to a series of armed conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas. Um, so this is when we see John Brown and other abolitionists strategically, purposefully moving westward into Nebraska, Kansas, that area there, Iowa even, to stop the westward expansion of slavery. And so this is when things start to get really, really violent. The next one, a landmark Supreme Court decision that held that the U.S. Constitution did not extend American citizenship to people of Black African descent. This was in 1857, and this one has a Minnesota connection. So this is the Dred Scott case. It's probably one of the most, what I've found in all the readings, one of the most important cases ever tried in America. Dred Scott versus Sanford was a landmark decision. The Supreme Court decided in 1857 that the Missouri Compromise was void and that no African Americans were entitled to citizenship. It hastened the Civil War and eventually led to the freedom of all enslaved people in the United States. And there's other webinars and things you can watch about the Dred Scott case. It has a connection to Fort Snelling up in the Twin Cities, so that definitely has a Minnesota connection there, and enslaved folks being brought into Minnesota. And then another one I want to mention, another case took place in 1860. An enslaved African American woman was freed from her Mississippi owner in a Minneapolis courtroom. So this took place right in Minnesota. The trial did. And this would be the Eliza Winston case. So although slavery was legal in southern states, Minnesota banned the practice in its first state constitution in 1857. And what's interesting about that is what Dr. Jefferson has been uncovering with the research on Winona, and specifically the First Congregational Church of Winona, which is her church. And she was doing a lot of research helping get that church listed on the National Register. In the church archives, she was discovering everybody's an abolitionist, and many of them were involved in the Underground Railroad out east. And many of these folks end up becoming involved in the Constitutional Convention here in Minnesota and like advocating and fighting for the prohibition of slavery in Minnesota. So making sure that it is in our Constitution here in the state that is illegal. And things got very heated and very icky in those state constitutional conventions. So under the U.S. Supreme Court's 1857 Dred Scott versus Sanford ruling a few years earlier, an enslaved person could not become free simply because he or she lived in a state that banned slavery. So with help from black and white abolitionists of Minneapolis, Eliza filed suit for her freedom. And on August 21st, 1860, she was freed from her Mississippi owner in a Minneapolis court. After being granted legal freedom, however, Winston faced white mob violence and was forced to leave the area. So this event showed that although slavery was illegal in Minnesota, many white Minnesotans supported the practice when it economically benefited them. And so this wording was from the Minnesota Historical Society website. But just important to know that enslaved persons were being brought into Minnesota. Even if freedom seekers ran away from their enslavers in the South and made it to Minnesota, they were not necessarily free here. It's great that Eliza Winston was freed, but Dred Scott and his family was not. And Eliza Winston, even once she was freed, they had to usher her away because she was being mobbed by white people who didn't agree because they didn't want to piss off the Southern investors that were coming into Minnesota, vacationing in Minnesota, investing in things here in Minnesota, all because of slave labor. So when I'm doing this research, I hear a lot of myths, and like I go into these historical societies, and these myths are kind of perpetuated in folks that I talk to in these little historical societies too. Oftentimes people will say, well, Minnesota was part of the Free Territory, so there weren't slaves here, and why would there be abolitionists here? And that's kind of a overwhelming response I get from folks when I mention abolitionists and the Underground Railroad here. And so we just kind of talked about that, but I'll touch on it some more. Yeah, in writing, it was supposed to be a free territory, but in action and in enforcement, it definitely wasn't. And there were not many black, biracial, multiracial people here in Minnesota prior to the Civil War. That's another myth that we hear. A lot of times people will reference the census. Well, based on the census, there was only, 50 black people. And that's what they'll use. You cannot trust the census. Like every historian and researcher should know that. You cannot trust the census. And I'll give you some examples why here in a minute, but um, the researchers that we've been working together for the past year, this group of folks with Micah Anders leading the way, who are researching like early black settlers, early black folks in Minnesota. I think we all could agree that there were way more people of color here prior to the Civil War than anyone has ever guesstimated before. And we'll probably never know how many exactly, but it's a much bigger number than any of the books tell you. As more and more documents are being digitized, we are learning more stories literally every day. Another myth that Black, biracial, and multiracial civil rights activism did not start in Minnesota until after the Civil War. You know what? As soon as there were Black people and biracial people here in Minnesota, they began working for equality. It goes way back. It goes way back hundreds of years. So just to kind of illustrate this a little bit better, this is kind of a timeline that I wanted to show in a simplistic, quick way, because the first time I did this presentation, it was almost 2 hours long, and specifically because this slide has too much in it. But if we go back on the way left, the early 1600s, the fur trade begins. And when we think about the French fur trade, and it wasn't just the French, because within the fur trade, you had like high up officials who were Scottish, who were French, who were British, but a lot of those voyageurs were French. And so you have black servants brought in, enslaved servants. This is, the history of Canada. There's lots of research on this early on. And then eventually some of those folks are going to be intermarrying with the voyageurs, with the native peoples. And so we get this community known as Métis, Afro Métis. I just learned that term literally like 2 weeks ago. So Métis, we think of like French and indigenous. And we see that a lot in the fur trade, but there's also an Afro Métis where you have African ancestry within that French and indigenous. So it's just this beautiful culture. And that culture is alive and thriving today. If you go to a powwow anywhere in North America, you're going to see Afro Métis folks at those powwows. Um, and then when we think of the Red River ox carts from the 1820s to the 1870s, that was a major transportation route. And there was a lot of movement, and folks were coming from through that Red River Valley, but they were coming right down through what we call the Twin Cities today and down here into southeast Minnesota as well. So these kind of byways of movement and people of all different ethnicities that could be mixing together, there's a lot of potential there. And we know what was happening. I mean, there's a handful of documented individuals and communities. So just think of all those cases that haven't been documented, right? You can kind of imagine. I'm just going to mention real quickly. So Andrew York was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was an enslaved man. I can't remember if it was Clark or Lewis's family that had enslaved him. But so this is a very common thing where you have these military officials or they're appointed by the government officials and they have enslaved servants with them. And many of those servants are Black or they have African ancestry, mixed African ancestry. Then we also see up on the top there Reverend Alfred Brunson, who was an early missionary, a Methodist missionary, and he covered this huge area. He was preaching to the Dakota people, but he covered from like Rock Island, Illinois, all the way up to Fort Snelling, and I think he went out towards Madeline Island in Wisconsin too. It's just massive area, and because he was working with the Dakota communities, he wanted an interpreter who could speak Dakota, and so at Prairie du Chien, he actually found this James Thompson, who was enslaved man there who was African. I think he was African and French, but he was married to a Dakota woman, so he knew the Dakota language. And so Reverend Brunson was able to raise money from churches out east and pay to free James Thompson, and then he hired him to be his interpreter. And I just learned that story just this past year. Below is Dred and Harriet Scott, who were brought to Fort Snelling by their enslavers who were military officials or worked for the military. And then we have George Bonga up on top, who was a voyageur, who was a French Ojibwe African, actually I think African Ojibwe voyageur, descended from an enslaved person in the fur trade. And then down below we have Joseph Godfrey, who his mom was actually enslaved, and she was brought to Prairie du Chien by her enslaver Alexis Bailey, and then from there she was brought up to Fort Snelling. Joseph, I think, was born up at Fort Snelling, and then later his mom Courtney got brought back down to Prairie du Chien, and Joseph was up at Fort Snelling. He ended up running away and finding shelter among the Dakota people, and there's legends of him crossing back through southeast Minnesota, headed down to Prairie du Chien, and he'd cross back and forth to visit his mom at Prairie du Chien. So that's an interesting story if we have a fugitive, enslaved person that's living in the region for many years, running back and forth. Who was aiding him? Where did he find shelter in those journeys? Because that's a long haul to go from, Mankato area to Prairie du Chien. And then I mentioned the ginseng rush from 1859 to 1862. This is something I just learned about this past year too. There was this big ginseng rush, and nobody's really written much about the slavery side of this, but it has been documented that there was um, uh, two men that had come up here from some other state, and they were harvesting ginseng, and they actually brought up some enslaved people to help dry and process that ginseng. So it's like that's one documented case where an industry did that, but who's to say that wasn't being done in other industries that were popping up in the 1850s in Minnesota and it just didn't get documented? Um, and on left-hand side, there's a picture that I found at the Waukesha County Historical Society at Reed's Landing when I was flipping through a book. And I don't know if this picture is from Reed's Landing or somebody sent it in from somewhere else. It didn't have anything on the back of it. But this is one of those Red River ox carts. And if you look on the cart, there's three men. And of course, this is a black and white photo, so it's kind of hard to interpret it, right? But the man in the back who's like holding up a fiddle sure looks like he could have some African ancestry to me. And I just put that little snippet from an article, Negroes and the Fur Trade. This was written in 1934 in the Minnesota History Magazine. Historians and researchers have been looking at this topic for decades. So it isn't like us researchers right now are just like super genius or something. People have been looking at this. Um, but I think because, like I said, more and more records are being digitized, we have access to knowledge and stories that they never had access to. So we're pretty fortunate to live in the era that we live in. And this was a quote from the Minnesota Historical Society Minopedia, but I think it captures kind of what I was just trying to say. The pre-statehood community in the 1830s and 1840s included enslaved and free blacks, a larger number of white army personnel and fur traders, and a still larger population of mixed race and Métis people. The majority population was Dakota and Ojibwe. This diversity, along with the absence of a cash crop economy, made for more fluid race dynamics than elsewhere in the U.S. In addition, enslaved people exercised greater independence and freedom of association than was common in the plantation South. So we have folks here intermarrying and moving. They have the ability to move. So we really don't know what was going on. So Mary Elise Antoine is one of the folks I interviewed. She's a historian down at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Prairie du Chien and Fort Snelling are intimately connected to each other through the military posts. You had Fort Crawford and Prairie du Chien, Fort Snelling up in the Twin Cities. And so you have a lot of fur traders, you have a lot of military folks, you have a lot of indigenous folks going back and forth between those two locations using the Mississippi River as the travel corridor. And so she wrote this book, Enslaved, Indentured, Free, Five Black Women on the Upper Mississippi, 1800 to 1850. And I asked her, how did you choose the five women? And she said, well, there was over 200 Black people living in Prairie du Chien in this era. There was only five that they had enough information that they could actually write about them. Wow, I got goosebumps when she said that. And that makes me think of all the other places, across the region where there could have been a lot more folks with the fur trade, with the military, and they just weren't documented. Um, so one of the other reasons I wanted to talk to her was because here in Wabasha County, where I live, up at Reed's Landing, was a really early fur trade post. And Augustin LaRoque, he goes by Augustin Rock, Augustin Roque, Augustin LaRoque. He was the head of that fur trade post there. And I knew that like within the fur trade realm, you have multiracial folks. And so I was curious if he would have ever had contact with enslaved people or he himself would have maybe had servants. So I started going through tracking him and following the census records. And I found in 1820, when he was at Prairie du Chien, at least when the day the census was taken, if you scroll down to the second from the bottom there, total free colored persons one. If you go up a few more lines, it says free colored person, male, 45 and over. So this tells us a little bit more about this person that was living with Augustin Roque in 1820 at Prairie du Chien. He was a colored man who was over 45 or older. And so I wanted to know more about that. So I asked Mary, and she said, well, probably what it was that these fur traders, they were not rich. Even one like Augustine, who was kind of a higher up, he wasn't like a voyageur. He was an actual trader who had a post or a fort post, sorry. And so he would come up for the winter and stay the whole cold season up here to do the trading with the Indians. And then he would come back down in the springtime to Prairie du Chien. And so over those cold winter months, he would need somebody to look after his farmstead because these folks usually had a small farm to sustain themselves. They didn't make enough, just fur trading. And so this man was probably a hired servant to look after his property while he was gone. He doesn't show up on any of the other census records, but you have to remember it's going to be another 10 years before the next census. And he doesn't show up having any other servants in his household on any of the other census records. But I wanted to know, could this servant have come with Augustine up to Wabasha here on an off census year? You can't say no to that because we don't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? So there's always a possibility that these folks were moving up and down with their enslavers or with the folks that hired them as servants. So if you want to know more about this topic in particular, there's been a lot of research on it. And so like I mentioned, Dr. Christopher Lehman, Dr. William Green, they've written some amazing books. And you can also go on to YouTube. There's webinars that they've done specifically on these topics if you want to learn more. So when I think about the abolitionists in our area, how do I even figure out who to look at? There's so many people that came and went through this area in the 1850s or before the end of the Civil War. How do we narrow down our search? And so Carol Jefferson has taught me, all of this stuff here. We oftentimes start with like one of the county history books. So like these big old books that like almost fall apart when you open them. The history of Wabasha County, the history of Fillmore County. And so, like, I have one at home, the history of Wabasha County, that's my copy. It has like 100 flags in it because I go through and I skim, and there's these things I look for, and I stick a flag if it's somebody that I'm like, this is a suspected anti-slavery person. Put a flag in there, and then I have to do some more digging. So some things we look at. We start with a book like that, and then we're going to look at. Sometimes in the book it'll say like this person was an abolitionist, this person was involved in the Underground Railroad. That's great. That's happened twice. We've had three people that's happened with. Obituaries. If you follow up, and now, like I said, things being digitized with the newspapers, you can find their obituaries. Oftentimes, it might mention it in an obituary or a tribute that somebody wrote about a person after they passed away. Family stories. This has been great. Sometimes on Ancestry, people literally put the story right there. Like this was in my family Bible, and it's the story of my, whatever great 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 that was an abolitionist. Um, when we have a suspected anti-slavery abolitionist, I'll go into Ancestry, I'll create a family tree, I'll go back 3 generations. So I look at their father, their grandfather, and their great-grandfather. Same with the mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. And that's going to be multiple great-grandparents, grandparents. And then you follow down to the end of the Civil War. So you're looking at a lot of people, but you're trying to see within their family circles were there abolitionists and anti-slavery folks. And I found some really cool folks doing that research. It takes like a week per person, so it's a lot of digging around. You also look at, when you're looking at census records, where people were coming from before they came to Minnesota. Were they living in abolitionist hubs out east? That can be a nice clue as well. What were their religious affiliations? Congregational churches are a big red flag. The Congregational Church was an anti-slavery church. It supported the American Missionary Association, which was an abolitionist organization. These folks ended up doing a lot of work with the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Congregational Church is one to look at. And in Minnesota, as communities are popping up in the 1850s, the Congregational Church is almost always the first church to pop up. They were those missionaries, many of them were trained at Oberlin, which was an abolitionist college. And the goal was to get out onto the frontier, be in front of the people coming, establish those churches, and really preach anti-slavery, stop the spread of slavery. Quakers. Oftentimes, Quakers were abolitionists and involved in the Underground Railroad. Not always. We do have a case of some Quakers that came to Minnesota with their enslaved persons with them. So it's not always the case, but by and far, a lot of the Quakers were involved in this movement. Methodist Episcopal Church, Free Will Baptist Church. So those are some of the churches. If we were in a hub like a real urban area and you had an African Methodist Episcopal Church, that would definitely be a place to start looking at members because they were very active out east in the Underground Railroad. Political affiliations. So at this time in the 1850s, the Republican Party, once it was founded, was the anti-slavery party. And you had the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, the Conscious Whigs Party, but there was different, like I said, degrees of like anti-slavery stances within each of those parties. But by and far, we see that Republican Party being connected to abolitionists. And so when you go through those county history books, and there's like little biographies on the people that were here in the 1850s, oftentimes they're really proud of their political affiliation, and they will say he was a proud Republican or he was an active radical Republican, or there's certain phrasing you can look for that's a big red flag. Did they serve with the U.S. colored troops? So if it was a white officer within the Union in the Civil War and they advanced and served with the colored troops, that's another thing to look at because they had to go through some screening and some hoops to get qualified to serve with the colored troops. They didn't want racist, ignorant people working with the colored troops. And so oftentimes we have folks who are abolitionists in those roles. And then their involvement with the Freedmen's Bureau as the war comes to an end. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help formerly enslaved folks with education, housing, jobs, trade skills. And so we see a lot of abolitionists that go and work for the Freedmen's Bureau as teachers and officers in the Freedmen's Bureau. And then also I mentioned the American Missionary Association. If you come across people that were affiliated with that, if they were donating money to that, if they were a member of a church that was donating money to the AMA, those are all red flags. And then Oberlin College. And we have folks scattered around Southeast Minnesota who are attended Oberlin College. And like I said, that they were preaching anti-slavery in their classrooms there at Oberlin. After the Civil War, were these folks involved with temperance, women's suffrage, equal education for all? Those are clues that they were probably anti-slavery before the end of the Civil War. And then as far as occupations, this is just me observing this. Like I'm always trying to look for commonalities among these folks that we're researching. Postmasters, holy moly, there's so many postmasters that were abolitionists. And if you think about it, this is before telephones. This is before you could text or email. If you want to communicate a message, it's going to be by letter. And so if you're doing Underground Railroad operations, you're going to want trusted people in those like postmaster positions. So that's kind of just interesting to think about. We also see a lot of ship captains, Great Lake ships, sea ships, Upper Mississippi River, and steamboat ships. So that's interesting. And there's a whole organization focused on like maritime and ship captains who are involved in the Underground Railroad. Lawyers is another one that pops up a lot. Preachers, people within the religious realm. And then in our area, the main industry by and far was farming. So we see a lot of folks who are farmers too. And so this was that Maritime Underground Railroad I mentioned. You can go online and check this out, but there's all kinds of interesting stories and research about the ship captains. And I mentioned this because, one of I guess the strongest cases for the Underground Railroad in Minnesota was actually published back in 1895. So this isn't a secret. It's been out there for a long time. The St. Paul Pioneer Press ran a story in 1895. They had interviewed this Joseph Farr. He was a biracial man, and he talked about when he was young, he was a cabin boy on the Dr. Franklin steamboat on the Mississippi River. The Dr. Franklin ran from Galena to St. Paul regularly, back and forth. And he talked about how at Galena, they would sneak freedom seekers onto the boat and hide them. And then when they got to St. Paul, there was a whole network of Underground Railroad folks that would help get these folks to Canada. And some of the way they would go was toward Milwaukee and Chicago, because once they're on the Great Lakes, then you have these Great Lakes sea captains that can get them across to Canada. There is some speculation that possibly maybe some of them were going up to Duluth and getting on ships at Duluth. And we do have an early Black community, a Black presence in the Duluth area. And I mention that because a lot of times when you're talking Underground Railroad, you want to look for Black folks, multiracial folks, biracial folks who are part of that network, because oftentimes they were the big conductors. And then you had station masters who maybe might have been white folks sprinkled in between those routes. So Joseph Farr's story is really interesting, and he's mentioning this Dr. Franklin. Well, Winona was founded by Captain Orrin Smith there on the left-hand side, on the upper left, and he was a steamboat captain. He and this Captain Daniel Smith Harris were both very famous Upper Mississippi River steamboat captains. Like if you Google that era, it's like almost all the stories are about those two. They were related to each other through marriage. They each married Langworthy women. The Langworthys were sisters, so they were related through marriage. The Langworthys also did some steamboating and uh, mining iron in the Galena and Dubuque areas. And Orrin Smith and Captain Daniel Smith Harris also, they came from out east with their families, these kind of colonies of people that came to Galena to mine the lead. And those two families were very lucky because they both struck like major ore loads, became very rich, and they invested in steamboats. Um, so Captain Orrin Smith, he founds Winona like early on. It's like 1852 or something like that when he lands in Winona. And his brother there, Captain Samuel Tinker Smith, is down in La Crosse. He's also a steamboat guy for a while. They ran temperance steamboats, so they did not allow alcohol on their boats. And Captain Orrin Smith would always dock his boat on Saturday night. It did not run on Sundays, and they would resume travel on Mondays. So he was very religious as well. Captain Samuel Tinker Smith down in La Crosse, he helped found one of the Baptist churches in La Crosse. And digging in those records, just through what I could find online, that church was actively donating to the Freedmen's Bureau right after the Civil War. So I'd like to try to get into their church archives and see if they were supporting the American Missionary Association or some other things like that. Sometimes churches were actively, like they had ladies sewing circles that were actually sewing clothes to send to freedom seekers, to Underground Railroad folks out east to be able to clothe the freedom seekers that were headed to Canada. Sometimes too, they were sending other care packages to support Underground Railroad operations out in the east. So sometimes that is in church records, and that would be cool if we could find something on him. But Daniel Smith Harris ends up, his first wife dies, and he remarries this Sarah Coates Harris. And there's been some like little rumors that she was an abolitionist and that they were involved in the Underground Railroad. Well, what's interesting is Captain Orrin Smith and Captain Daniel Smith Harris at one point joined together and they run the Minnesota Packet Company, which the Dr. Franklin steamboat was part of. So when we're talking about Joseph Farr and this first person primary source of the Underground Railroad being connected to the Dr. Franklin, these two steamboat captains become pretty suspicious. Well, his second wife, Captain Smith Harris's second wife, Sarah Coates, I reached out, I tracked down a descendant, and she really hadn't done a lot of research on Sarah Coates Harris. She's like, yeah, I've heard the stories. I don't know if I really believe them. I haven't really had a chance to dig around. So I did a little digging around, and I didn't have to dig around real far. Sarah Coates Harris is actually from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. If you know anything about the Christiana resistance or the Christiana riots, where she grew up and where her family continued to live after she got married and moved away is right where the Christiana resistance took place, which is a major kind of slave revolt, um, as slave hunters came to take these enslaved persons back to the South. These freed blacks, white abolitionists, and runaway slaves fought back, and it was like a big battle. It was a big deal. And her family is like living right in that area there. Anyways, she's involved. She's involved. Her name pops up in a whole bunch of different things on different anti-slavery society meeting minutes and conventions. So she was actively involved in that kind of stuff. And then also the Freedmen's Aid Society in Galena. She's the president. Her name's right on there as the president. Also, going through these digitized newspapers in Galena, you start to find different Black folks and people of color that passed away, and in their obituaries, they're referencing Captain Daniel Smith Harris, that they were in the employ of the Harris household for decades. So the Harris family had a connection had a relationship, I would say, with the Black community of Galena. And their house in Galena is a bed and breakfast. So I'd like to go stay there sometime. But it's called the Steamboat House. And on the website, it talks about how it was an Underground Railroad station. Now, the descendant said she doesn't believe that. There's just not enough evidence. But supposedly there's tunnels underneath this mansion. And they've said for decades that this was an Underground Railroad stop. It's just interesting if you think of the Dr. Franklin, you think of Joseph Farr's story about the Underground Railroad and that boat. I mean, it all kind of makes sense, but we don't have enough information to say for sure. I also interviewed a historian out in New York, and she has been in researching the Underground Railroad there. She grew up in this town. She's the kind of the community historian, and before that, her mother was. And so she's heard growing up all these stories in the Underground Railroad. And I reached out to her because a family that ends up in St. Charles and is buried in the St. Charles Hillside Cemetery in St. Charles, lived in this town where she is doing her research. So she talked about this Olean Buffalo Road that ran north to south from the Pennsylvania border up to Buffalo, New York. There was this area between Franklinville and Ishua along this Olean Road, and there was a little settlement there called Cadiz, Cadiz, Cadiz. Many locals were vocal abolitionists, and after the Civil War, some of them identified William B. White as being involved in the Underground Railroad in Cadiz. So William B. White is the one that came to Minnesota after the Civil War with his two daughters and his wife, and they're buried in the cemetery there. But this on the far right is his son George Leonard White. And George Leonard White was musically talented. He was a school teacher. He joined the Union Army when the Civil War kicked off, and he went down south after the war and taught for the Freedmen's Bureau. He taught at Fisk University, and because of his like attraction to music, he loved the spirituals that the formerly enslaved people would sing, and they formed a choir at Fisk University, and he became like the coach or advisor for that group. And they blended like the African spirituals that had been handed down through the enslaved families with more modern kind of hymnals and kind of created this hybridized spiritual. And he met Laura Cravath and married her. She was also a teacher at Oberlin, and then they became kind of the I don't know what you call them, advisors for this Jubilee Singer group. So the Fisk Jubilee Singers then traveled around and put on concerts to raise money for the university, and they became very famous. They traveled all over the world. They performed for the Queen of England. Unfortunately, Laura died while they were on tour. She died over in Scotland, pretty young too. But the Cravaths, her father, Orrin Cravath, who's on the left-hand side, they came to St. Charles in like 1856 to Winona County, and they lived in Saratoga, which is kind of south of St. Charles. That was a stagecoach stop there in Saratoga. There's an early congregational church. It still stands, but it's been converted into a private residence. Orrin Cravath, one of his other children, is in the middle here. This is Erastus Milo Cravath, and he ended up going to Oberlin and became a congregational minister. He was a chaplain during the Civil War, and then he worked for the Freedmen's Bureau and established schools and colleges down all across the South. And he actually was one of the co-founders of Fisk University. So there's this really interesting connection to all these things. And Cravaths, when they were out in New York, Cortland County, New York, before they came to, it was Homer, New York, Cortland County, before they came to Winona County in Minnesota, they ran an Underground Railroad station there. And so what's really interesting is those homes where these men lived before they came to, or where these families lived before they came to Winona County, they all have historic signs talking about the Underground Railroad. And these aren't National Park Service signs. These are just through their local historical societies. We could do this kind of thing here in Minnesota too, just documenting these abolitionists and the work that they did that is documented on the Underground Railroad out east. So that's the Cravath family. Here's a picture of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. And if you go on YouTube, you can actually, there's a recording from like 1900 or 1901, but they still perform. They're still an active group and they travel around. And that's on my bucket list to get down there and actually attend a live concert. I think that would be so amazing. Another person I interviewed was Eric Smith, and he's a descendant of the Jeffrey family. And these guys came to Hart, Minnesota in like 1856, 1857. I'm going to kind of follow my script because there's a lot here. I realize I've already gone over an hour here. So the Jeffreys originate from several indigenous tribes, the Niantic out of Connecticut, the Montauk out of Long Island in New York, and the Narragansett out of Rhode Island. Their civil rights work goes back to way back when the U.S. government began taking indigenous lands from their tribes on the East Coast. The Jeffreys are truly multiracial. As Eric said, this is the only race of people I know that are classified different throughout their lifetime. They start out being classified as mulatto, then they're referred to as Indian, then colored, and then Negro. And there's also reference of them being black. So there's all kinds of stuff on these guys. They're part of the first documented sit-in that he's been able to track down in the United States. And it took place at their church where there was segregated seating and they were being forced to sit in the back. They were also involved in something called the Beeman Triangle out in Connecticut. So the Beeman Triangle is they played a key role in the Beeman Triangle, an activist community that sustained one of the state's first black churches, formed some of the earliest African American anti-slavery societies, served as a stop on the Underground Railroad, and became a center of free Black home ownership. Wow. So they leave Connecticut. They're in New York for a while, along the Erie Canal. They end up in Onondaga, Michigan. I say that wrong every time. And then they come to Minnesota. So they kind of migrated through a few different states. In 1858, Josiah B. Jeffrey here in, well, actually, let me back up. When they were out in Connecticut, this was in the 1830s or 1840s, they actually signed this repeal of the Canterbury Law, which was kind of like the fugitive slave law. And so Eric shared this with me, like their signatures are on, there's like 4 different Jeffreys that are on that, and they are the same Jeffreys that came to Winona County in Minnesota. And then in Ontonagon, Michigan, the National Park Service has done a nice little bio on the family and their abolitionist background. While they were in Ontonagon, Michigan, there was an Underground Railroad incident and they were like associated, they were connected to that. And then I found this just like a month ago. I was doing some research at the Winona County Historical Society on Hart, this little tiny ghost town. And just in this folder, willy-nilly with some different newspaper articles, was this Xerox copy of town election minutes from 1858. So Benton is what they used to call the town of Hart, and then they had to change the name because there was already a Benton. And this is 1858, and what I circled, it says Overseer of the Poor, Josiah B. Jeffrey. So this is one of the earliest records of a person of color being elected to office in Minnesota that we've been able to find, which is pretty cool. And the neat thing was his brother, if we go back, his brother Asa Jeffrey, oh, it's not gonna let me go back, was elected Overseer of the Poor back when they were in Onondaga, Michigan. So that's kind of interesting. In 1865, this is the census from Hart Township, and this is just some of the Jeffreys. If we were to go over one county to the or one township to the east, we would see a whole bunch more, and then if we would go down into the city of Winona, we'd see a whole bunch more. They were all part of this, Eric said, clan. It was this big family clan, and there was a lot of sisters and daughters that married different men with different names. So there's a lot of different names. These are all Jeffreys here, I think. Oh, there's a couple. There's a Berkshire on here, but so the tick marks are for if they were male, female, or colored. And so these are all folks that were identified by the census taker as colored on the 1865 census. Eric also shared with me the cemetery plot map from Woodlawn Cemetery in Winona, where some of his ancestors are buried. And you'll notice the names on the right-hand side: Halsey, Jeffrey, Vincent, Stone, Johnson, Bergstripe, Bourne. So Jeffrey is just one of the names, and this is just some of the names. There's a whole bunch of them. If you look at Betsy Jeffrey, the second down, she was 97 years old. She was the matriarch of this family, and her dad was like a Montauk chief. So she was a direct descendant from this specific tribe out there, and she had some really interesting stories that were published in the Winona newspaper later in her life. So what's interesting is if we go just a few miles, like 12, 15 miles to the west of where the Jeffreys family were living, the Easton family was living in St. Charles. It's also Winona County. And the Easton family is also a multiracial family. So I was able to track down George Price, who's a descendant of this family, and he's like through a cousin line, and he's written books. He's a academic retired professor from the University of Montana, Missoula. He was African American history and Native American history. And like I said, he's written a couple books specifically about his family and their involvement in early civil rights and abolitionist work. So up in the upper right corner, we have Joshua Easton. Him and his brother James came with their mother Anna. Anna is on the left at the top. We don't have a picture of James, which is interesting because James was a photographer, but there's no picture of him. And so a little bit of what George shared with me. The Eastons were active leaders in the abolition movement in Massachusetts. Several members of the Easton family came to St. Charles, Winona County between 1856 and 1860. So we mentioned the brothers James and Joshua Easton. They opened up a hotel in St. Charles, and their mother Anna French Keith Easton, she purchased a farmstead out on the edge of town, like on the east of town, headed towards Winona. And then we also see Isaac Talbot show up on these census records around 1860, and he's believed to be related to the family. And now there's some kind of debate on how he's related, but I found some documentation that seems to indicate he was probably a nephew to James and Joshua and a grandson to Anna, because Anna's first marriage to Isaac Keith, She had four kids, one daughter that died like at the age of 9 or 10 or something like that, another daughter that lived to have a couple kids and then died, and then she had two sons. And so those were all white children because her first husband was white. Then her second husband was Dr. James Easton Jr., and he was multiracial. And then she had James and Joshua with Dr. James Easton Jr. So from her first husband, that first marriage, one of those daughters that survived long enough to have a couple children, I think Isaac and Rachel Talbot were those grandchildren because they show up in her household on the census before the 1850 census. So before they came to Minnesota, those two children, they're like teenagers at the time, are in her household. And so I think they're the grandchildren actually, but we're still trying to figure that one out. Also, what's interesting is Anna Keith, so her first husband, that Isaac Keith, one of his sisters also comes to Minnesota at this same time. So it's Lydia Howard Keith. She married James Franklin Hall. They go to Owatonna first. I think he enlists in the Civil War when he's at Owatonna, and then after the Civil War, they're in Lake City up in Goodhue County along the Mississippi River. So that's interesting that there's more folks from this kind of clan that came out this way, and I just found them a couple weeks ago. I'm doing some family tree stuff. Um, so the son, James Easton, who we don't have a picture of, he married Lucy Jane Bolt, who's in the bottom right-hand corner here. And then they had a son named Hamlet, and he's the one in the bottom left. And so Lucy Jane Bolt and her husband James Easton, they opened a photography business in St. Charles and then they moved it to Rochester, Minnesota. And in 1869, when Frederick Douglass was in Minnesota, he actually came to Rochester and he had his photo taken by James Easton in his photo studio. The Eastons knew Frederick Douglass. So did the Jeffries family. So that's an interesting connection there. And when I asked both Eric Smith and George Price, do you think it's a coincidence that the Eastons and the Jeffreys, they came to Minnesota like at the exact same time and they're only like 15 miles apart and they both said no way and heck is that a coincidence? I mean, that had to have been planned. And they didn't realize that their families like knew each other. They didn't even know these families. And then when I started to do a little digging around, we find that through the Beemans, Reverend Amos Beeman was a famous abolitionist preacher. He was friends with Reverend Hosea Easton, who was a famous abolitionist preacher. And Hosea Easton had married some of the Beemans and the Jeffreys. So these families were connected. They did know each other. And that's interesting when we're looking at a Black or multiracial connection to this Underground Railroad myth in Southeast Minnesota. That's significant. So I mentioned George Price has a couple of books out there. The one in the middle really dives into like the Easton families movement and their efforts with abolitionism. He didn't write about their time in Minnesota, and actually some of the things that I was able to share with him, he had never heard before. So that's kind of exciting. So I started to dig around a little bit more to find more of a connection between the Jeffreys and the Eastons, and I did find different little newspaper clippings that were talking about Reverend Hosea Easton conducting marriage ceremonies, where we have Beemans and Jeffreys. And what's interesting about this one from 1833, look at the newspaper. It's from the Liberator. If you know anything about abolitionists, that's a big newspaper. That was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. So that's pretty neat that this was mentioned in that newspaper. Another family I want to mention is the Mitchners. This is down in Cherry Grove in Fillmore County. I interviewed Andrea Overing, who's a direct descendant of John Longstreth Mitchner, and he was a Quaker. And I'm just going to kind of give a few highlights from this interview. So his family, the Mitchners and the Longstreths, they go way back to William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania. It was part of a utopian colony that was seeking religious tolerance. John Mitchner was born in Pleasant Grove, Ohio, which was a hotspot for Underground Railroad activity. He grew up during the Hicksite Revolt, which was a schism that split the Quakers into two factions. So while both groups opposed slavery, the Hicksites were more outspoken and they actively were involved in the Underground Railroad. And his family favored the Hicksite Quakers. In 1775, the Mitchners were some of the earliest to manumit their slaves. So this is pre-Revolutionary War or right around the time of the Revolutionary War. John's great-great-grandfather, William Mitchner, was a member of the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, which was later called the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He moved to Wells County, Indiana, not far from where famous Quaker abolitionist Levi Coffin operated an Underground Railroad station. John was exposed to the writings of and speeches of many outspoken abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Charles Lennox Raymond. Raymond is spelled Remond. He was a free black man from Massachusetts whose ancestors were enslaved on the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And I really liked Andrea in the interview. She said, these people all knew each other. They all talked to each other. Their big brains talk. So thinking about how they may have been gathering in these spaces that maybe weren't necessarily like, advertised, but they're networking and they're talking and they're thinking about this topic. So even though there isn't much documented history on the Mitchners actually being involved in this movement, in 1848, when John Longstreth Mitchner and his wife gave birth to their first child, they named him Charles Raymond, Remond Mitchner. And that same year, Frederick Douglass named his son Charles Raymond Douglass, same spelling. So they really, thought a lot of this Black abolitionist. There were small scattered Quaker settlements in southeast Minnesota and several along the border of Iowa. The documented Underground Railroad routes in Iowa end with question marks just south of the Minnesota border. So things to think about. And with the Mitchner family, I started digging around more into the family tree a few weeks ago, and I found like through cousins who married other folks, we bring in Edward McMaster Stanton, who was on Abe Lincoln's cabinet. We also get to Lewis Tappan, who was a famous abolitionist. So these families, like she said, their big brains talk. They're connected to some of these big players. Another gentleman I came across was Reverend Peter Akers, who was a Methodist minister. He was a circuit minister originally, so he traveled all over Illinois preaching anti-slavery, especially. He was known for these big, long anti-slavery sermons. And he came to Red Wing to help with the founding of Hamline University. He was one of the earliest faculty there. He was there for 6 years prior to the Civil War. And so I was able to talk to a descendant of his to find out a little more about Reverend Peter Akers. So besides his time at Hamline, he served 3 terms as the president of McKendree University, and he also co-founded McMurray College. In 1837, he gave a prophetic sermon during a frontier tent revival in which he predicted that slavery would come crashing down in the coming decades. A lot of people in the audience were pro-slavery. He went on a long anti-slavery rant, exclaiming, "Who can we say but that a person will lead us through this strife is standing right here?" And literally 30 feet away from him was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was deeply affected by this sermon, according to biographer John Wesley Hill in his book Abraham Lincoln, Man of God. So this is 1837 when he gave this sermon. This is when Lincoln was still a lawyer. He wasn't president or anything yet. And this biographer says that Lincoln had a very poor night's sleep after hearing this sermon. And when he came back to his practice in Springfield the next morning, his partner said, "Why do you look so haggard today?" And he said, "Well, I heard this sermon last night and I saw myself playing an important part in that strife." So he was really he felt like that message was specifically for him, that like this was some kind of a vision. He was going to be playing a critical role in what would later be known as the Civil War. So in 1941, Henry Simon was commissioned by the Work Progress Administration to paint a mural of this famous sermon. The painting is known as Peter Akers' Prophecy. It's located at Wells High School in Chicago. And so that's that painting right there in the picture. It says, after his time in Minnesota, Peter returned to Illinois, where the people of Jacksonville built him a house to live out the remaining years free of charge, and he's buried alongside many abolitionists in the Diamond Grove Cemetery in Jacksonville. Okay, we also have the Garrard family up in Frontenac, and this one I could actually do a full hour program on, so I'm going to try to skim through it. I was not able to get an interview with a descendant. We emailed back and forth, and just it never worked out. I tracked down though. She did say, check out this book. It's called This Quiet Dust. It's a novel that was written about the Garrard family and their time in Frontenac, Minnesota, up in Goodhue County. So I actually was able to track down the author of that, even though that book was written in 1975 or 1976. So 50 years later, I sit down with the author to interview him, which was a really interesting interview. And the Garrard family, they came from Cincinnati, Ohio. They have connections to Kentucky. There's been a lot of articles and books written about them, but not in any of these books or articles has anything ever been referenced to anti-slavery or abolitionism. So I was like, there was some really big clues there that weren't hard for me to see, that like I would look closer at these guys. So I did a little bit of digging, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of this, but yeah, definitely Garrard ancestors in Kentucky were involved in anti-slavery work. Israel's mother, Sarah Bella Chalmers Ludlow. The Ludlow family in Cincinnati, Ohio, are huge. They're elite key players involved in anti-slavery work. Her brother was on the executive committee of the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. So all kinds of stuff going on there. When her first husband, Jephthah Garrard, dies, she remarries John McLean. John McLean was the Supreme Court justice during the Dred Scott case, and he was one of only two judges that actually said Dred Scott was free. And what's interesting about Judge McLean is throughout his entire career, all the cases that he tried, a lot of them had to do with runaway slaves and slavery. He always was consistent in saying once they step foot into free territory, they are free. So interesting stuff there. And there's more to be found out about the Garrards. Oh, another thing I did learn through that book that Ivan Kabista wrote about the Garrard family. Many abolitionists, well, I shouldn't say many, but there's several very high profile abolitionists that came and stayed at Frontenac. It was after the Civil War, but they were friends with Israel Garrard. And so digging into that connection, it's like, yeah, we could do a lot more research on that Garrard family. The McMasters is a family I came across up in Wabasha here, and actually the very first interview in this project was with one of their descendants. So these guys were Irish immigrants. And what's funny is Carol would always say, don't waste your time with the Irish or the Catholic. Like she would kind of, if you want to be efficient when you're kind of going through a list of folks, here's what to look for. And it definitely usually isn't Irish, even though we do find some Irish abolitionists. Oftentimes, by the time they got here, there was a lot of competition for jobs. And so they weren't really working together oftentimes. But these guys were Irish immigrants. They came to Reed's Landing in Wabasha County in 1857. So these are brothers Thomas and Joseph McMasters. They brought with them a printing press and they opened the very first newspaper in Reed's Landing. It was called the Wamedy Herald. They printed their first issue on May 12th, 1857, and then to celebrate, they went out on a sailboat. Unfortunately, the sailboat flipped. They didn't know how to swim and they both drowned. So there was only ever one issue of this newspaper, and we've only ever found two copies of it. And these brothers, after they drowned, they found one of the boys right away. The other one, it was 6 weeks later, and in his pocket, folded up, was one of those copies of the newspaper. So up at the Historical Society here in Wabasha, I was able to track down an article that actually had a copy of the front page of that original newspaper. And as I was scanning through that, I'm like, this sure sounds anti-slavery to me because they were saying like, we are going to be a beacon of the truth, and basically, no matter who it pisses off, we're going to write the truth. And just the way they were wording things, I was like, these guys sound like abolitionists to me. So I tracked down a descendant. She was able to tell me that when they came to the United States, they first went to Pittsburgh, their whole family, not just the two boys, but their whole family. They had a brother who was our uncle who was already in Pittsburgh. He had been there for a while, and he was involved in a famous court case involving the Underground Railroad that he had assisted a freedom seeker there in Pittsburgh. And actually, when he died, his obituary said the death of an Underground Railroader. These McMasters brothers and some of the other people in their family all signed this letter that was in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, March 8th, 1854. It was titled Irishmen Writing to John Mitchell, and it was an anti-slavery letter. And they signed their names to it, and we see a bunch of the folks that signed that end up here in Wabasha County in Reed's Landing. There's also letters on file with the Minnesota Historical Society where the brothers were writing back and forth to family in Ireland, and they're writing about anti-slavery sentiment here in Minnesota with the election and things building up, or here in the United States, I should say. So they're very anti-slavery leaning letters. So those are just some interesting clues. Their younger brother, William McMaster, he was too young. He wasn't on the boat with them, and he wasn't involved with their newspaper. But after they pass away, he goes off and apprentices across the river here over on the Wisconsin side, I think in Pepin. He apprentices as a printer there, and then he ends up running the Republican newspaper out of Lake City for decades. And he was a really admired journalist. So I need to dig more into some of the things he was writing about to get that, better idea of their abolitionist stance. But yeah, there's newspaper articles from Pittsburgh about their uncle. So that's just interesting. The Bowden family was one that Tina talked to somebody who talked to somebody and then said, talk to Sarah. And so the descendant, Tina, that I've been meeting with, we meet regularly. We try to meet like every other month to help her family kind of unravel this mystery. But basically, her grandpa or her great grandpa came to Wabasha. No, it would be her grandpa. No, her great grandpa came to Wabasha in 1914. they believe on the lumber rafts. He was working the logging rafts along the Chippewa River there. He was born in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. And he would tell stories to his kids, Judy and Levon. Um, and they, Judy and Levon, no, that's his grandkids. Judy and Levon were ones that I interviewed along with Tina. And so they talked about how their grandfather Alex, that's what it was, their grandfather Alex would tell these stories when they were kids about his grandparents, because Xavier used to pass these stories down to his kids. So it's these stories that have been passed down through multiple generations. But Xavier in this picture, he's the one that came from Montreal, Canada, and he came to Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and he talked about how his family in Montreal were involved in the Underground Railroad when enslaved persons made it to Canada. It didn't necessarily mean everything was peachy. There were people up there who were pretty ignorant too. And so they had a whole network of folks in Canada that would help these people find homes, get medical treatment, find jobs. And so the Bowden family was assisting freedom seekers once they got to Canada. And supposedly Xavier's mom was a midwife. She would always have a basket of herbs and tinctures ready to go. So if there was somebody that needed help, she could grab that basket and run. And so those stories have been handed down for generations. Well, one of the aunts had done a little bit of history digging around and written some articles for some newspapers. And so there's kind of this scrapbook of like cryptic, you know, little clues, and the family's trying to figure out more about it. The aunt wrote about, the Xavier telling these stories of the Underground Railroad. And so we're just trying to trace down like what exactly was going on in Montreal. Could this have been happening after he came to the United States? Because he left in 1860. He came to Minnesota, or he came to Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin in 1860. And he also talks about coming down through the Red River Valley to Prairie du Chien and then up to Chippewa Falls. So I'm like, is that Red River Valley, Minnesota, or is that the Red River to the east? We're not 100% sure exactly. Also, there was this article that was like written in 1961. We tracked down with some clues on the back that was from the Kenosha, Wisconsin newspaper, but it was about the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. And taped to that article was this picture of this black woman that's standing next to this old log cabin. And the family seems to remember having heard a story that she was a descendant of one of the freedom-seeking families that made it to Montreal, and that the family stayed in touch. So we're just trying to figure this out. It's kind of interesting. There's also a story of the Steinbauers, once again down in Hart, this little ghost town that's southern Winona County, right on the edge of Fillmore County. And so this one is interesting. I interviewed a descendant of the Steinbauers. Her name is Mary Ann, and she shared, so her family came from, they claim Czechoslovakian on the surveys, but they're like more Prussia. So I don't really know the history of that region there, but Steinbauer sounds German, but it's kind of near Czechoslovakia as well. And they were very civic-minded, hard workers. They came in the 1850s through the 1870s. There was like this like wave of migrations of several Steinbauer family members. Steinbauer actually means stone builder, and so some of them were stonemasons. The Bison's quarry in Winona was originally the Steinbauer quarry. It's a famous quarry in Winona. And there's also on private lands in the area, there's like a Steinbauer cave that has really intricate stonework and a door on it. And there's kind of a legend that a crazy Steinbauer once lived in the cave back in the 1800s. So we're just trying to kind of link some of these clues together. So this here in this picture is Joe Steinbauer, who was born in 1901 in Hart, Minnesota. And he was born on the Steinbauer farm. He was a farm laborer, a farm hand all of his life. His family eventually sold their farm to the Zabel family. And I had a chance to interview Dan Zeibel a few years ago. He didn't want it to be recorded, but he just took me out and we talked, and I kind of typed up notes from that interview. But he said when he was a kid, this Joe Steinbauer was an old guy at the time, and would tell him lots of stories about the area, the history of the area. And this Joe Steinbauer talked about how his ancestors were involved in the Underground Railroad in the Hart area pre-Civil War or during the Civil War. And so Dan grew up hearing these stories. Mary Ann didn't know anything about that. She had never heard anything within her family about the Steinbauers being involved in the Underground Railroad. So we're trying to, talk with more neighbors who might have more clues. The farm is still standing today, and there's definitely parts of this farm that go back to the 1860s, 1850s. So it's just kind of another piece in the puzzle. I'm going to close with this last quick story here. William Stork was one of those stories that just, it was there. It was in the Fillmore County history book because this guy kept a diary, and there was some of his writings published in that, where he said he formed an anti-slavery group when he came to Fillmore County in the late 1850s. And so I was able on Ancestry to find an ancestor, and we interviewed him. And he actually has the diary of his great 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 grandfather. So he read to me from the diary. And so what he was telling me that William Stork was born out in New York, and then the family moved to Lake Geneva, Walworth County, Wisconsin, which if you Google that, there's Underground Railroad things in that area of Wisconsin. And he really didn't concern himself with abolitionism. Um, it wasn't really affecting him personally, so he didn't really think much of it. And in Lake Geneva, the churches would bring in abolitionists to debate that topic, and he would always go and just be a stinker. He would ask stupid questions or just questions to stir the pot. He would play the devil's advocate. One time, he actually rang the church bell during the debate just to like be a stinker. But then there was one debate that like triggered something in him, and he started thinking about Black families, multiracial families that he had known out in New York that had come and shopped in the store where he worked. Like he had relationship with some of these folks and got along with them, and they were decent people. They were great people. And so all of a sudden he has this kind of epiphany, like God literally touched his heart, and he sat down and he started to cry because he's like, I have just been an ignorant sinner. And so we have a quote from the diary. So this one always makes me cry because it's like, how cool that this guy, he's already married with kids. He's lived a good chunk of his life, and he has this just 180-degree turn of heart. He says, I saw plainly that I had thus far opposed a holy cause, and a sense of condemnation stole over me. I sat down and cried with remorse, and then and there vowed to atone for my former opposition and neglect by my future devotion to the cause of abolitionism, and well have I redeemed that pledge. So he goes on to commit himself to abolitionism. He gets involved in some anti-slavery stuff in Wisconsin, and then he comes to Minnesota and forms this anti-slavery group in Fillmore County, which we can't find anything on except for this diary entry. He does mention some other folks, Daniel Dayton and After Hogue, who are other folks living in the Harmony area at that time. After Hogue, I did a family tree on. He's Quaker, and there's actually some of his ancestors who were Underground Railroad folks. And then Daniel Dayton, they built the stagecoach stop that was called the Ravine House near Harmony. And so curious to dig into that a little further. He becomes an early legislator in Minnesota. So we have some more work to do. So these are only a handful of anti-slavery folks that we were able to track down, folks we could interview. I'm not kidding you. There are dozens and dozens and dozens. Every single town out here, I believe, probably had abolitionists living there in the 1850s. And so my final thoughts, my takeaways here, yeah, we had abolitionists all over the region. Probably every single community down here. We're probably never going to know an actual like final number, a really accurate number of how many anti-slavery folks were here. And what's really, I think, powerful that we can relate to like today is that the stories of these people tell us that we should never doubt that a small group of folks can change the world, because that's exactly what the abolitionists did. And then also, when I think of that William Stork, no matter how old you are, there's always an opportunity to change, to be a better neighbor. So we did start a Facebook group called Freedom Stories of Southeast Minnesota. Folks can hop on there and share stories they've heard. We're trying to do like a crowdsource thing where people can kind of share the myths that they've heard about in our region. And I can tell you, I've given 2 presentations so far, and I've had a line of people come up to me with leads or with, possible hints. So we have these stories in our minds, and they've been, we've heard them. If we've grown up in the area, we've heard them. We need to write them down and document them so that future researchers can do some more research and digging. And there's a ton of resources out there if you want to learn more about this realm of early Black settlers, abolitionists, early civil rights in Minnesota, leading up to the Civil War and shortly after the Civil War. Lots of resources out there. You'll get sucked into the rabbit hole. You can join me in the rabbit hole. So thank you so much. I hope you learned something, and feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or comments. Have a great day.